Welcome to today's deep dive, where we'll be delving into the life and works of Fyodor Dostoevsky. We're going to be using excerpts from an article called Fyodor Dostoevsky, a master of human nature and literary genius. But I think what's most interesting here is how Dostoevsky's life kind of mirrors the themes he explored in his books.
Yeah, definitely. It's funny, when you look at a lot of authors, you can see similar themes and struggles reflected in what they write. And Dostoevsky, well, he's like a prime example of that.
So the article talks about his early life. And let's just say it wasn't easy. Strict father, losing both his parents as a teenager, and then being arrested for his political views. It's a lot to deal with at such a young age.
Yeah, no kidding. I mean, it makes sense why his writing is so intense and, well, often pretty dark. It's like all those early experiences really shaped his whole view of the world. How he saw human suffering and his fascination with all the darker parts of human nature. It really comes through in his novels.
Right, and we can't forget the guy was sentenced to death. I mean, sure, he was spared at the last moment, but still, imagine the impact that would have on you. Being that close to death has got to shift your perspective on life.
It must have. And then on top of that, he spends 4 years in a Siberian prison camp, surrounded by criminals, seeing all that brutality and deprivation firsthand. That kind of experience really exposes you to the depths of human despair, the fight for survival, and the ever-present reality of death. All those themes just run through his entire body of work.
It's almost like he lived the stories before he ever wrote them. Do you think that's what makes his writing so, I don't know, unsettling? It feels so real, like he's tapping into something primal about the human experience.
Yeah, there's definitely a raw honesty to his work. He doesn't try to romanticize suffering or make moral dilemmas simple. He just lays it all out there, the full complexity of it all. And it can be unsettling, but also it just pulls you in.
The article mentions how his early success with Poor Folk, which dealt with poverty and social injustice, kind of foreshadowed his later political activism. Seems like he was always drawn to those themes of suffering and fighting against oppressive systems.
Yeah, and it's fascinating how that early novel really captured the public's attention, even got praise from those tough literary critics. It showed his talent for portraying the lives of everyday people, their struggles, their humanity, which would kind of become his signature in later works. But it also, in a way, sealed his fate. You see, the success of that book and his involvement in reformist groups put him on the radar of the authorities. And that's what ultimately led to his arrest.
So it's like his writing, his passion for exposing injustice landed him in Siberia. It really makes you think art can be dangerous, especially when it challenges the way things are.
Absolutely. Dostoevsky really believed in the power of art to uncover truth, to make a difference, to shed light on the human condition. And he was willing to risk everything, even his freedom, to give a voice to the voiceless, to explore the complexities of morality, and to challenge conventional thinking. And you see that courage reflected in his writing. It's what makes it so powerful and enduring.
I'm curious, what do you think of his writing style, the way he gets inside the heads of his characters, their conflicts, their doubts, the ways they justify their actions? It's almost like reading a psychoanalysis in the form of a novel.
He was amazing at getting inside the minds of his characters. I mean, he portrayed their thoughts and motivations with such depth and nuance that it was groundbreaking for his time. He wasn't just telling a story. He was dissecting the human psyche, exploring those dark corners of the mind and showing the hidden motivations that drive our actions.
Which brings us to one of his most famous works, Crime and Punishment. It's more than just a crime story, right? It's like a deep dive into morality, guilt, and what goes on in the mind of a murderer. And it seems like this whole idea of the extraordinary man is key to how Raskolnikov justifies his crime.
Oh yeah, the extraordinary man theory is fascinating because it really pushes us to think about our own ideas of morality. Raskolnikov believes that some people, because they're geniuses or they have the potential to benefit society, are exempt from the usual moral rules. Of course, it's a dangerous idea, but it raises some big questions about power, the limits of individual freedom, and what happens when people think they're above the law.
It makes you wonder, did Dostoevsky actually believe this theory himself? Or was he using Raskolnikov as a way to explore the dark side of that kind of thinking? I mean, his own life was all about fighting for social justice against oppression, not about some people being above the law.
That's a great question. And it's one of the things that makes Dostoevsky so intriguing. He doesn't give you easy answers. He gives you complex characters grappling with tough choices. And then he leaves it to the reader to wrestle with what it all means.
So with Crime and Punishment, are we supposed to sympathize with Raskolnikov? To understand his reasons, even if we don't agree with what he did?
That's the brilliance of Dostoevsky's writing. He forces you to confront the complexity of human motivation. We see Raskolnikov's desperation, his poverty, his intellectual arrogance, and yeah, even his twisted sense of altruism. He's a deeply flawed character, but Dostoevsky portrays him with such psychological depth that you can't help but be drawn into his inner turmoil.
Speaking of flawed characters, let's move on to the brothers Karamazov. We have three brothers, each representing a different side of human nature, and a father who's, well, not exactly father of the year material.
Right, the Karamazov family is like a mini version of all the conflicts and moral struggles of humanity. Dmitri is all about passion and impulsiveness. Ivan represents intellect and skepticism, and Alyosha embodies faith and compassion. And their father, Fyodor Pavlovich, he represents debauchery and self-indulgence. He's like the embodiment of those dark impulses that Dostoevsky saw as corrupting society.
Sounds like a recipe for disaster. I'm guessing their interactions weren't exactly peaceful family dinners.
You got that right. The novel is a whirlwind of philosophical arguments, emotional outbursts, and moral crises. Dostoevsky uses the conflicts within the family to explore these big questions about faith, free will, the nature of good and evil, and that universal search for meaning in a world that can feel pretty chaotic.
And then we have the Grand Inquisitor chapter. I've heard it's one of the most powerful and challenging parts of the novel.
Oh yeah, it's like a masterpiece within a masterpiece. Ivan, the skeptical brother, imagines this conversation between Jesus and the Grand Inquisitor. And the Inquisitor argues that humans just can't handle real freedom, that they're inherently weak and need structure and authority.
It sounds like a pretty radical critique of religion, almost like a rejection of the idea of a benevolent God.
It's definitely complex, and it can be interpreted in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
But it definitely raises some deep questions about faith, the role of institutions in shaping our beliefs, and that tension between individual freedom and social order.
It seems like Dostoevsky is making us think critically about these issues, to question our assumptions about religion, about authority, about what's good and what's evil, and the fact that he does it all within a novel, through the voice of a character, makes it even more compelling.
Exactly. It lets them look at these ideas from different angles, to create a dialogue between different viewpoints, and to engage the reader in a way that you just can't do with a straight-up philosophical essay.
It's like he's inviting us into the conversation, challenging us to wrestle with these questions right alongside his characters. And I think that's why his work is still so relevant today, even though he was writing over a century ago.
Oh, absolutely. The themes he tackles, faith, doubt, the search for meaning, the fight against injustice, those are things we're all still dealing with. And the way he gets into the psychology of his characters, their motivations, their justifications, their rationalizations, that's something that'll always resonate with people.
It's like he was anticipating the work of psychologists like Freud, who would later dig into the unconscious mind and the hidden things that shape our behavior.
He was definitely ahead of his time in understanding human psychology. And his portrayal of mental illness, especially in Notes from Underground and The Idiot, was incredibly insightful for his era.
Do you think that's part of what makes his work so unsettling? The fact that he's not afraid to show us the dark side of humanity, the irrational, the obsessive, those destructive impulses that are kind of in all of us.
I think that's part of what makes it so captivating. He doesn't try to sugarcoat anything. He shows us the whole spectrum of human experience, the good, the bad, the beautiful, the ugly. And I think that's why his characters feel so real, so relatable, even when they're doing awful things. We see ourselves in them, even in their flaws and their failures.
Speaking of flaws and failings, let's circle back to Crime and Punishment for a minute. Raskolnikov is clearly a complicated guy, capable of great compassion but also cold-blooded murder. How do we reconcile those two sides of his personality?
That's the challenge, isn't it? To understand how someone can be both a monster and a human being at the same time. Dostoevsky doesn't offer easy answers, but he shows us the full arc of Raskolnikov's psychological journey, from his initial reasons for the murder to his eventual confession and acceptance of punishment.
Yeah, I remember those descriptions of his guilt and paranoia after he commits the crime. It's like he's being eaten alive by his own conscience, haunted by what he did, even as he tries to justify it.
Dostoevsky was a master of capturing that psychological torment. He knew that guilt can be a far more powerful punishment than anything external. And for Raskolnikov, it's ultimately his own conscience that pushes him toward redemption.
But it's not just Raskolnikov who's struggling, right? The novel is full of characters who are dealing with their own moral dilemmas and existential crises.
Exactly. You've got Sonia, the young woman forced into prostitution to support her family. And then there's Porfiry Petrovich, the investigator who seems to understand Raskolnikov's inner turmoil even better than he understands himself. Each character adds another layer to this exploration of morality, guilt, and that search for meaning in a world that often seems devoid of justice.
And it all takes place against the backdrop of St. Petersburg, a city that Dostoevsky portrays as both beautiful and oppressive, a place of hope and despair all at the same time.
The setting is definitely key in this novel. The crowded streets, the poverty, the grime, they all add to this feeling of claustrophobia and moral decay. It's almost like the city is a reflection of Raskolnikov's own troubled mind.
So we have these complex characters, a morally ambiguous crime, and this oppressive setting. It all makes for a pretty intense reading experience. I can definitely see why Dostoevsky isn't for everyone.
Yeah, it's not exactly light reading, that's for sure. But for those who are willing to engage with it, to wrestle with those tough questions he raises, he can be incredibly rewarding.
And speaking of tough questions, let's go back to the brothers Karamazov. You mentioned the Grand Inquisitor chapter, which seems to really challenge how we think about religion and human nature. Can you talk a bit more about that?
Sure, it's a pretty dense and philosophical chapter, but basically it's a critique of the idea that humanity can handle true freedom. The Grand Inquisitor argues that people are inherently weak and crave structure and authority. He believes the church, by simplifying faith and giving people rules to follow, is actually doing them a favor, even if it means taking away their freedom.
That's a pretty provocative argument, and I'm wondering how it connects to Dostoevsky's own views on religion. Was he a believer, agnostic, atheist?
Well, that's a question that scholars have been debating for ages. Dostoevsky's own religious beliefs were complicated and changed throughout his life. He was definitely influenced by his Orthodox Christian upbringing, but he also struggled with doubt and questioned traditional religious dogma.
So maybe the Grand Inquisitor chapter isn't about giving answers. Maybe it's about raising questions, about making us confront the complexity of faith and the limits of what we can understand.
I think that's a really good interpretation. Dostoevsky wasn't interested in preaching or offering easy solutions. He wanted to provoke his readers, to challenge their assumptions, and to get them thinking for themselves. And I think that's what makes his work so relevant, even today.
It's amazing how he manages to weave these philosophical and theological debates into such compelling storytelling. His novels are full of drama, suspense, and emotional intensity, but they also make you really think about the big questions in life.
He was a master at combining psychology and philosophy, the personal and the universal. And that's why his work continues to resonate with us, because it speaks to something fundamental about being human, about our search for meaning, our struggle with faith and doubt, and our capacity for both immense love and terrible darkness.
I'm curious about your thoughts on Dostoevsky's legacy. He's obviously had a huge impact on literature, but his influence goes beyond that, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
His work has influenced philosophers, theologians, psychologists, political theorists. Thinkers like Nietzsche, Freud, and Camus were all deeply influenced by his explorations of existentialism, the psychology of guilt, the nature of freedom and responsibility.
It's amazing to think about how far his ideas have spread, how they've touched so many different fields of thought. It really speaks to the power of his writing and how he was able to connect with these universal human concerns that go beyond time and place.
And I think his legacy is still unfolding. As we face new challenges in the 21st century, political polarization, social injustice, the rise of technology, Dostoevsky's work still offers insights into human nature and that ongoing struggle for meaning and purpose, in a world that can feel pretty chaotic and overwhelming.
I want to go back to something you said earlier about Dostoevsky's grasp of human psychology. It seems like he was especially attuned to those darker aspects of our nature. The capacity for cruelty, self-deception, and violence. Would you say that's an accurate assessment?
I think he was certainly aware of that potential for darkness within all of us. He saw the horrors that people are capable of inflicting on each other, both in his own life and in the society he lived in. But I wouldn't say he was only focused on the negative. He also believed in the possibility of redemption, and the power of love and compassion to overcome even the darkest impulses.
That's an interesting point. There seems to be this tension in his work between those two extremes, recognizing human depravity, but also believing in the possibility of transcendence.
I think that tension is exactly what makes his work so powerful and lasting. It reflects how complex we are as humans, the fact that we're capable of great good and great evil. And it leaves us with the challenge of figuring out how to navigate that tension, how to make choices that lead us toward the light instead of the darkness.
So it's not just about understanding the dark side, it's about actively choosing to resist it, to try to be better, even when it's hard.
Exactly. And I think that message is more relevant now than ever.
It's interesting how Dostoevsky's work seems to anticipate some of the things we're dealing with today. Like the extraordinary man theory in Crime and Punishment feels connected to our current conversations about power and privilege and who gets to make the rules.
It's a timeless idea, this belief that some people are above the law because of their wealth, their status, or their supposed brilliance. And Dostoevsky shows us how dangerous that kind of thinking can be, how it can be used to justify cruelty and oppression.
It's almost like he's warning us about the dangers of unchecked power and the importance of holding those in authority accountable for their actions.
Exactly. And he's also reminding us that we all have a responsibility to stand up to injustice, to speak out against oppression, to fight for a more just and equitable society.
So his work isn't just about understanding human nature, it's also about inspiring us to take action, to try to make a difference in the world.
That's right. Dostoevsky believed in the power of literature to change hearts and minds, to challenge the way things are, and to inspire people to work towards a better future.
And that brings us back to the question of his enduring legacy. Why do you think people are still reading Dostoevsky today, more than a century after his death? What is it about his work that keeps resonating with modern audiences?
I think it's his ability to tap into those fundamental questions about human existence that we all grapple with, regardless of time or place. Questions about the meaning of life, the nature of good and evil, the longing for love and connection, and the struggle to find hope in a world that can often feel bleak and despairing.
And he does it in a way that's both intellectually stimulating and emotionally gripping. His novels are page-turners, but they also stick with you long after you've finished reading them.
They challenge us, provoke us, and ultimately, I think, make us more human, more aware of the complexities of our own hearts and the world around us.
It seems like we've only just scratched the surface of Dostoevsky's work in this deep dive. There's so much more to explore, so many layers of meaning to unpack.
He was such a prolific writer,
Yeah.
and his novels are so rich and multifaceted. Each one offers a unique perspective on the human condition and raises profound questions about our place in the universe.
I'm curious, for someone who's completely new to Dostoevsky, where would you recommend they start? Which of his novels do you think is the most accessible entry point into his world?
Ooh, that's a tough one, because each novel offers something different. But I think Notes from Underground is a good place to start. It's relatively short, but it's really impactful. It introduces some of his key themes: alienation, the search for meaning, the nature of consciousness, all in a very concentrated form.
And it's also a bit more darkly humorous than some of his other works, which might make it a bit easier to digest for a first-time reader.
Yeah, definitely. There's a kind of sardonic wit to the narrator's voice that makes the philosophical and psychological exploration a little more palatable.
So, for our listeners who are intrigued by what we've been talking about today, Notes from Underground sounds like a good place to begin their Dostoevsky journey.
Absolutely. And from there, they can dive into the amazing and expansive world of his other novels, each one offering its own unique and compelling perspective on the human experience.
I'm curious, after all this time studying Dostoevsky's work, what stands out to you the most? What's the one key takeaway you would want our listeners to remember?
That's a great question. I think for me, the most important thing Dostoevsky teaches us is the power of compassion. Even when faced with suffering, cruelty, and despair, he never loses sight of the human capacity for love, forgiveness, and redemption. And I think that's a message we all need to hear, especially in the world we live in today.
That's a beautiful thought, and I think it speaks to the enduring power of his work. It's not just about showing us the darkness, it's also about reminding us of the light, the possibility of hope and healing, even in the midst of suffering.
And it's about challenging us to be better, to strive for a more just and compassionate world, even when it seems impossible.
It sounds like Dostoevsky's work is as much a call to action as it is a literary masterpiece.
I think that's a really good way to put it. He wasn't just a writer. He was a moral philosopher, a social critic, and a truly compassionate person who believed in the power of art to change the world.
And I think his legacy continues to inspire us to do the same, to engage with the world, to fight for what's right, and to never lose sight of our shared humanity.
Perfectly said. And I think that's a perfect note to end on.
So it's not just about understanding the dark side, but it's about actively choosing to resist it, to try to be better, even when it's hard.
Right, and I think that message is more relevant now than ever.
It's interesting how Dostoevsky's work seems to predict some of the things we're dealing with today, like that extraordinary man theory in Crime and Punishment feels connected to all these discussions we're having about power and privilege. And you know who gets to make the rules?
It's a timeless idea, this belief that certain people are above a law because of their wealth, their status, or because they think they're brilliant. And Dostoevsky shows us the danger of that thinking, how it can be used to justify being cruel and oppressive.
It's almost like he's giving us a warning about the dangers of unchecked power and how crucial it is to hold people in authority accountable for what they do.
Exactly. And he's also reminding us that we all have a responsibility to stand up to injustice, to speak out against oppression, and fight for a society that's more just and fair.
So his work goes beyond just understanding human nature. It's about inspiring us to actually do something, to try and make a difference.
You got it. Dostoevsky believed that literature had the power to change people's hearts and minds, to challenge the status quo and inspire people to work towards a better future.
Which brings us back to his lasting impact. Why do you think people are still reading Dostoevsky today, over a century after his death? What is it about his work that continues to resonate with modern readers?
I think it's his ability to connect with those fundamental questions about what it means to be human. The questions we all wrestle with no matter the time or place, like what's the meaning of life? What's the difference between good and evil? The need for love and connection, and the struggle to find hope in a world that often feels pretty bleak and depressing.
And he does it in a way that's both intellectually stimulating and keeps you on the edge of your seat. His books are page-turners, but they also stay with you long after you've finished reading them.
Yeah, they challenge us, make us think, and I think they make us more human in the end, more aware of how complex our own hearts are in the world around us.
It seems like we've just barely scratched the surface of Dostoevsky's work today. There's just so much more to explore, so many layers to unpack.
Oh, he was incredibly prolific, and his novels are so rich and multi-layered. Each one offers a totally different perspective on the human experience and asks these profound questions about our place in the universe.
For someone who's totally new to Dostoevsky, where would you suggest they start? Which of his novels do you think is the easiest to get into?
That's a tough one, because each one is so unique. But I'd say Notes from Underground is a good starting point. It's pretty short, but it packs a punch. It kind of lays out some of his core themes like alienation, the search for meaning, and the nature of consciousness, all in a pretty concentrated form.
And it's got a bit more dark humor than some of his other books, which could make it a little easier to digest for someone just discovering him.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
The narrator has this sardonic wit that makes all those philosophical and psychological explorations go down a little smoother.
So for our listeners who are intrigued by everything we've discussed today, Notes from Underground seems like a solid starting point for their Dostoevsky adventure.
Definitely. And from there, they can dive into the amazing and vast world of his other novels, each one offering a totally unique and compelling look at the human experience.
Now, after spending so much time with Dostoevsky's work, what has resonated with you the most? What's that one key takeaway you'd want our listeners to remember?
That's a good question. I think the most crucial thing Dostoevsky shows us is the importance of compassion. Even when faced with all that suffering, cruelty, and despair, he never loses sight of our ability as humans to love, to forgive, and to find redemption. And I think that message is more important than ever in today's world.
It's a beautiful sentiment, and it speaks to the lasting power of his writing. It's not just about showing the darkness, but about reminding us that there's light, too. The possibility of hope and healing, even when we're surrounded by suffering.
And it's about challenging us to be better, to work towards a world that's more just and compassionate, even when it seems impossible.
It sounds like Dostoevsky's work is a call to action just as much as it is a literary masterpiece.
I think that's a great way to put it. He wasn't just a writer, He was a moral philosopher, a social critic, and a genuinely compassionate person who believed in the power of art to change the world.
And his legacy continues to inspire us to do the same, to engage with the world, fight for what's right, and never lose sight of our shared humanity.
Beautifully said. I think that's the perfect note to end on.
It feels like we've been on this incredible journey through Dostoevsky's life and his books, and it makes me wonder, what makes him so unique? What sets him apart from other great writers?
For me, it's that amazing ability he had to capture the essence of human consciousness, like raw and unfiltered. He doesn't just tell you what his characters are doing, he throws you right into their minds. You experience their anxieties, the ways they justify themselves, even their darkest desires. It can be almost uncomfortable at times, but you can't deny how captivating it is.
Yeah, you're right. It makes you wonder how he understood the human psyche so deeply. Was it just his imagination, or do you think his own struggles played a part in it?
It's hard to separate the artist from the art with Dostoevsky. His life was filled with hardship, Poverty, illness, imprisonment, the constant fear of censorship. All those experiences definitely shaped how he understood suffering, alienation, and how fragile human existence really is.
And it goes beyond just individual suffering, right? He also looks at those societal forces that contribute to it. Things like poverty, inequality, and the abuse of power.
Yeah, definitely. Dostoevsky was very aware of the social injustices of his time, and he didn't hold back from showing them in his novels. He saw how those systems crushed people, how they created resentment, despair, and sometimes even violence.
It's interesting how those themes are still so relevant today. We're still dealing with a lot of the same problems. Economic inequality, political division, and trying to find meaning in a world that often feels chaotic and unfair.
That's why he's considered a timeless writer. His insights into the human condition, both on an individual and societal level, are still relevant centuries later. He understood that humanity's fundamental struggles, the search for meaning, the battle between good and evil, the desire for connection, and the fear of being alone, those are things that go beyond any specific time period.
And he wasn't afraid to push his readers, was he? He gave us these moral dilemmas, these philosophical questions, without offering any easy answers.
Exactly. He wanted to make people think, to start discussions, to question their own beliefs about the world and their place in it. And I think that's a sign of truly great literature. It doesn't tell you what to think. It encourages you to think for yourself.
So after all this, what's the most important thing our listeners should take away? What would you say is the core of Dostoevsky's message?
I think the core of his message is that even in the darkest parts of human experience, there's always a chance for redemption, a chance to find meaning and purpose. His characters are flawed, they make big mistakes, they suffer a lot, but they're always reaching for something better, something bigger than themselves.
That's a really powerful message. And it seems especially relevant in today's world where we're constantly bombarded with negativity. And it's easy to feel overwhelmed by all the challenges we face.
It's a reminder that we're all capable of both good and evil, that life is a constant struggle, and that even when we feel despair, we can choose to have hope, to love, and to work towards a better future.
And that effort, that choice to try and be better, maybe that's the most valuable lesson Dostoevsky teaches us.
I completely agree. It's a message that transcends time and place, reminding us that even when we're surrounded by suffering, the human spirit can endure. And that search for meaning and purpose is a journey worth taking.
Well, this has been an amazing deep dive into the world of Dostoevsky. I feel like I've gained a whole new understanding of his work and the huge impact he's had on literature and thought. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us today.
It's been my pleasure to talk about Dostoevsky with you, and I hope our listeners are inspired to check out his books and see his brilliance for themselves.
And who knows, maybe they'll even find themselves asking those same questions that have been haunting readers for centuries. What does it mean to be human? What is good and what is evil? And what's our purpose in this vast and often confusing universe?
Those are the questions that Dostoevsky makes us confront. And maybe, by trying to answer them, we can come a little closer to understanding ourselves and the world we live in.
That's a powerful thought to end on. To all our listeners, thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We encourage you to keep exploring Dostoevsky's work and to share your own thoughts and interpretations.